Well, hello everyone. This is Minister Kate. Welcome to Reading the Christian Classics with Minister Kate. And we've been on part one. We were talking about Reverend Katie Geneva Canon. And this is actually part two. So if you haven't watched part one, you may want to go ahead and watch part one first and come on back for part two of this amazing study that we're doing on the life of Katie Geneva Canon. She passed, as I said in part one, she passed in 2018, and she was really a woman a woman of color who made great strides and great achievements in the gospel and for women of color and for Christianity overall. And I'm just encouraging everyone. As I read her, I'm encouraged, and I want to encourage you as well to be all that you can be. You've had dreams in your life, you've had aspirations, and some of us have had some letdowns, and we've given up on our dreams and we've given up on what we've aspired to in our youth. But I want to encourage you that it's not over until it's over, and you have so much time. You have time to be more and to elevate to what you believe that you can be and should be in the gospel or in life, professionally, or whatever we do it all in the name of God. That's for me, for my life. Everything that I do, I always have weight against what God has for me. What do I want to do as opposed to what he wants me to do? We all have aspirations that we want to do, but it's not in God's plan sometimes. And we have to sometimes correct our thinking, and adjust our thinking to be more in line with what he wants. And when he gets in the midst of what we're thinking and what we want to do in life, and in the midst of his plan for our lives, and our minds get corrected, as it were, to what he wants us to do, then we'll find that there'll be success. And not only will there be success professionally, but there'll be success in our hearts, and our minds will be at ease, and our hearts will be settled. So I encourage you to walk in what God would have you to walk in, and let's align our minds with the day. The day is far spent. Let's align ourselves with what he wants us to do. So enough of that. Encouraging you today to go ahead and do it. Just go ahead and do it. As I study, I know that don't know everything about the person, but we're studying together. We're finding out new things together. And it's exciting for me. I am a lifelong learner. I'm not in school anymore or anything, but I just love to see about new things. It makes life exciting. It makes, it's just exciting for me to learn about different people and different things and different aspects of life. So this is what this is really about, just learning about different people and their contributions to Christianity, their contributions to humanity overall. So we're talking about Katie Geneva Canon. We talked about her life, her early life, in the last episode. We're going to talk about one of her most renowned works, and that is Katie's Canon that we're talking about. This book was hard to get at one time, but I was able to secure a hardcover copy, which is always good for me. I like that. So Katie's Canon, Womanism and the Soul of the Black Community. Now, even though this is talking about the Black community, it's talking about a community as a whole, though impoverished, those who are considered as second-class citizens or what have you. So let's think of it in broad terms, how it is applicable to the poor, to the needy, to the sick, to the shut-in, to those who have disabilities, who are not really mainstream. So we can think of it in different ways and open up our understanding as to what it is that this is applicable to. But as for me, as a black woman, this is something that was interesting to me. Now, when she talks about womanism, we talked about this in the last episode. Womanism was a phrase that she heard from Alice Walker, and talking about the experiences of black women. And let's just go to the first paragraph here in the book where she makes a quote. And she says, this is a phrase, something that she heard from Shirley Ann Williams. She says, and when we, to use Alice Walker's lovely phrase, go in search of our mother's gardens, it's not really to learn who trampled on them, or how, or even why. We usually know that already. Rather, it is to learn what our mothers planted there, what they thought as they sowed, and how they survived the blighting of so many fruit. You know, we all go through certain things. As I think about this, we all go through our different situations and trials. What are we thinking about when we're going through the trials? And how, more importantly, do we rise above the day-to-day things, trials, tests? How do we rise above it and think on different things that edify our families, our own mind, our own mental health, our own hearts? You know, those were tough times, segregation, tough times. And they made it. People made it through, and they made it through. Sometimes, they were able to smile in the face of adversity, smile in their families, and raise up children and have happy times and stuff still. So how do we as people, when we go through different challenges, keep our smile, keep our positivity, keep other and breathe into the lives of others positivity and the likeness of Christ? How do we do that when we're going through trials ourselves? God has given us the grace to do so, and God continues to give us the grace to do so through our relationships with others, through prayer, through setting aside time with Him and meditation. How do you personally get through times when it's not the best of times? It all comes. There's all kinds of seasons in our lives, and we can get through it if we can get our minds to the place where God can speak to us. So I strive for that, and I believe that these women, in times of trouble, allow God to speak to their hearts. Let Him speak to your heart as well if you're going through any trials right now. When we look at womanism and womanist theology, it's really nothing new, in my opinion, it's really nothing new, because women have always preached through stories. Women have always preached through testimonies. Women have always preached about and incorporated their own testimony, their own lives into the stories of the Bible. They'll look back on the experiences of women of the Bible, of people of the Bible, and how it speaks to them, and how it speaks to them, and then in turn speaks out to others. And then what is important is that the womanist theology is looking to say, in my estimation, that all experience of God is important. All experiences of God, we look in books and you have the European experience of God written in books, but very rarely and seldomly do you see the black woman's experience brought out in books, and the importance of that experience to the congregation and to people in the world. So I think that all of our stories are valid. European, Hispanic, Oriental, Asian, all experience is important and is valid. And I think that's really the crux of what is being said in the womanist theology. All of our experiences are valid, and all of them can encourage one another to speak to someone else, to bring life to other people, to bring deliverance to those who need deliverance. All of it is valid. All of it is worth being shared, being written about, expressed to others. I always think back to people that have spoken into my life, and there are a lot. I call them the big girls in the gospel. And one that I can think of right now, you have Jackie McCullough, and you have Vesta McKenzie. But one that I think of that actually spoke to my life personally was Ernestine Cleveland Reams. Now, she was a fireball. We're talking about Canon now, but I'm saying how the experience of the woman preacher spoke to me and speaks life to others and brings deliverance to others. She would always, Ernestine Cleveland Reams would always speak about her experience of being in church and not being able to preach as a woman preacher. She would be able to preach, and she would always preach in her testimony, in the testimony service, because that's what we do. If you've got a word burning inside you and people were not letting you preach, you were going to preach in the testimony service. And that's what she would do. She would preach in the testimony service, and then she would talk about that experience as she had the platform to preach now. Preach to congregations and to the masses. She would talk about her experience of not being able to preach and wanting to preach, or coming up in the gospel. So we've always used our experience in our lives, in our preaching, and I think that's a lot of what womanist theology is, allowing that experience to come through in preaching. So it's the power of the story. The power of the story of God's supremacy in our lives, God's hand in our lives. The story of how he did it for me and how he can do it for you. Okay? So that's what I believe that is being brought forth in the womanist theology. Yes, it came out of woman on woman love, but I don't think that's where it ends up. And I think it's just giving a name to what we already what was already happening, what we were already doing. So let me get a little bit more into this. Time is running away. Okay, so what we're going to do here is, this is Katie's Canon. What I want to say is that, and go to the table of contents. Now, she has the foreword, the preface, the introduction. Chapter 1 is Surviving the Blight. 2 is Slave Ideology and Biblical Interpretation. The Emergence of Black Feminist Consciousness. 4, Moral Wisdom in the Black Women's Literary Tradition. 5, Women's Perspectival Discourse and Canon Formation. Resources for a Constructive Ethic, the Life and Work of Zora Neale Hurston. Unctuousness as Virtue, according to the life of Zora Neale Hurston. Maybe we'll deal with her as well. The Wounds of Jesus, Justification of Goodness in the Face of Manifold Evil. That's what we were talking about. The justification of goodness in the face of manifold evil. Womanist interpretation and preaching in the Black church. Okay, that's all right. 113 might be able to go there. Hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick, the womanist dilemma in the development of a black liberation ethic. 11. Appropriation and reciprocity in the doing of womanist ethics. Methodologies and dialogues teaching the womanist idea. Racism and economics, the perspective of Oliver C. Cox. And then appendix exposing my home point of view. So that's the table of contents in here in this book. Let's read a little bit of the first chapter, and then I want to try and read on 113 a little bit, Womanist interpretation and preaching in the black church. So let's go. Chapter 1. I am most aware of the rich lore I inherited from my mother's garden in Kannapolis, North Carolina. I recall particularly the stories shared during devastating thunderstorms, whenever there were gusty winds and heavy rain, accompanied by lightning and thunder. The Canon household became, and still does, a folklore sanctuary. We turn off all the lights, unplug electrical appliances, and leave the supper dishes sitting in the kitchen sink. When the whole family is seated strategically around the kerosene lantern, my mother, Corinne Light Canon, moves into her role as creative storyteller. My mother's style is to reminisce around a stock of historical images, themes, and cultural expressions that tell the story of the origin of black people in America. Much of what she recounts is based on the testimony shared across generations that her father, Emmanuel Clayton Light, born August 21st, 1865, was the only free child in his family. My grandfather's parents, siblings, and all others who preceded him were born into slavery. One of my favorite family legends centers around his mother, my maternal great-grandmother, Mary Nance Light, born in 1832. When freedom finally came, Grandma Mary walked hundreds of miles from plantation to plantation, looking for the children who had been taken from her and sold as slaves. With only instinct to guide her, Grandma Mary persisted until she found all her children and brought the family back together. As direct descendants of African American slaves, my family understands such tales as the indispensable source of black people's historical confidence and spiritual persistence despite all oppression. My mother's keen memory and her extraordinary artistic sense enabled her to pass on eyewitness accounts from freed relatives to succeeding generations. These narratives are the soil where my inheritance from my mother's garden grew. Historical context. As a student of slave narratives seeking the interior garden of Afro-American culture, I discovered unmistakable evidence that racial slavery in the United States was the cruelest of institutions. The unmitigated severity of slavery was based on the assumed principle of human chattelhood. As early as 1660, it was decreed that henceforth all Africans and only Africans and their descendants entering the colonies would be subject to an entire institutional framework that required them to be treated as objects, as possessions, rather than as human beings. The principle of chattelhood enabled the inner dynamics of racial slavery to expand until it penetrated the basic institution and ideological underpinnings of the entire normative order of society. And then she goes on to talk about the acquisition of slaves and the status of slaves, the exploitation of slave workers. And let's go to cultural inheritance. Despite the devastation of slavery, with its unremitting exercise of rural planter power and unconstrained coercion, my ancestors had the hours from nightfall to daybreak to foster, sustain, and transmit cultural mechanisms that enabled them to cope with such bondage. In spite of every form of institutional constraint, Afro American slaves were able to create another world, a counterculture within the white defined world, complete with their own folklore, spirituals, and religious practices. These tales, songs, and prayers are the most distinctive cultural windows through which I was taught to see the nature and range of black people's response to the dehumanizing pressure of slavery and plantation life. Even with cultural self expression outlawed, my ancestors never surrendered their humanity or lost sight of a vision of freedom and justice they believed to be their due. There was a critical difference between what whites tried to teach and what slaves actually learned. Against all odds, Afro American slaves created a culture saturated with their own values and heavily laden with their dreams. Folklore. The folk tales I have heard all my life were created by the slaves throughout the antebellum South as a strategy for coping with oppression and for turning their world upside down. Operating beneath a veil of pseudo complacency, black women and men tapped into a profound sense of cultural cohesion, creating an expressive system of coded messages to communicate what they considered good, worthy, and meaningful. Since their survival depended on keeping their true feelings undetected in the presence of whites, Afro Americans employed the wit, intelligence, and ingenuity of Brother Fox, Brother Rabbit, the Cinch Owl, and others to overwhelm and defeat the powerful foes. Old Master and his wife. An ancient black verse describes the proactive phenomenon of folklore in this way. Got one mind for white folks to see, another for what I know is me. He don't know my mind. So it goes on to talk about more spirituals. Steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. O freedom, I love thee. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Prayer. When the rain falls intensity and the wind's velocity drop and the lightning and the thunder recede, I know that the end of the storytelling is near. Believing that a direct personal relationship with God exists, my mother always concludes her stories with a long prayer of intercession, praise, and thanksgiving. Kneeling beside the couch, she prays for the needs of both the immediate and extended family. She celebrates God's goodness, majesty, and mercy. She frequently enunciates thanks for the gifts of the earth and for all the blessings received. After a period of silence, my mother then provides time for every family member to bear witness to the immediate powers of Jesus as heart fixer and mind regulator. This sacred corporate event is the direct and natural successor of the oral folklore and musical and religious music inherited from Afro-American slaves. Hence, I grew up understanding the black prayer tradition to be the authentic living bridge between black people's stories, black people's music, and black people's source of faith. In the past, my ancestors met in secluded places, woods, gullies, ravines, and thickets, aptly called hush harbors, to pray without being detected. Adeline Hodges, born a slave in Alabama, attests to the importance of prayer. The slaves weren't allowed to go to church, but they would whisper round and all meet in the woods and pray. The only time I remember my pa was one time when I was a little child. He set me on a log by him and prayed. Sometimes they prayed while huddled behind wet quilts and rags that had been hung up in the form of a church and tabernacle in order to prevent their words from carrying through the air. Other times they formed a circle on their knees and spoke their words into and over a vessel of water to drown out the sounds. Ellen Butler, born a slave in Louisiana in 1859, witnesses to this dimension of slave religion. Massa never allowed us slaves to go to church, but they have big holes in the fields. They gets down in and prays. They done that way because white folks didn't want them to pray. They used to pray for freedom. The tradition of the slaves' Hush Harbor prayer meetings lives on in my parents' home. With the abiding strength of the family legends planted in our hearts, my mother invites each one of us to pray, quote scripture, lead a song, or give a testimony, speaking under the unction and guidance of the Holy Spirit. My father, Esau Canon, testified about his own personal experience with God. My grandmother, Rose Little, lines out in long metered style her favorite psalms and spirituals. The rest of the family interjects Bible verses between the singing. The last thing we utter before retiring to bed is always Grandma Rosie's prayer. And when waste and age and shock and strife shall have sapped these walls of life, then take this dust that's earthly worn and mold it into heavenly form. Such is my inheritance. That's her first chapter, talking about her experience of the storytelling of her mother during storms, and how that relates to the experience of people of color who were enslaved at that time, before that, or how that tradition carried, the cultural tradition carried on. Okay, so that was the first chapter. How did you feel about her first chapter? I love the fact that there was the storytelling and mixed with the music, singing, mixed with prayer. And it gave them happiness and joy in times when they had to hide and not be known in that they were praying. Or she was talking about how the slaves would do that, so they would not be seen by the master. We're going to jump to chapter 9. I've only got a few minutes, but I did want to read a little bit of this. This talks about womanist interpretation and preaching in the black church. A new and significant connection is beginning to exist between the new modes of critical inquiry created by African American women in the theological academy and the central role that preaching plays as a cultural phenomena in the black church community. It is new because until recently, black preaching has not asked questions about womanist interpretation, and womanist theological studies have not included homiletics. It is significant because the majority of the faithful who have heard and continue to hear black preaching are women. While the majority of these churchgoers have little trouble testifying that a good sermon is a many splendid art form, the articulation of an analysis by which we elucidate and legitimize patriarchal teachings is not as easily arrived at. When sermons are written and presented in the interest of men, the categorical definitions of theological concepts lend an evidently weighty authority to androcentric conclusions about male preachers and masculine-centered culture. It is therefore important to analyze sermonic texts in terms of their ecclesial locations and theological interests, with special attention to their gender dimension. Such methodological analysis of sermonic text needs to be the task of womanist interpretation. My own proposal for the form this womanist interpretation should take lies in the convergence of a feminist liberationist theoretical interpretation inspired by Elizabeth Fiorenza's groundbreaking scholarship and the seminal work of Isaac Clarke Sr. on Black homiletics. These two dynamic areas of interpretative discourse offer a challenging nexus for womanist scholars concerned with radically rethinking and revisioning how duties and roles are advocated, how arguments are constructed, and how power is inscribed in the Black church community. A Womanist critique of homiletics challenges conventional biblical interpretations that characterize African American women as sin-bringing Eve, wilderness whimpering Hagar, henpecking Jezebel, whoring Gomer, prostituting Mary Magdalene, and conspiring Sapphira. A womanist hermeneutic identifies the frame of sexist, racist, social contradictions housed in sacred rhetoric that gives women a zero image of themselves. This analysis deconstructs biblical-based sermons that portray female subjects as bleeding, crippled, disempowered, objectified, purified, or mad. It enables us to ask hard questions about the responsibility of Black preachers to satisfy the whole congregation's spiritual hunger with their intellectual grasp, mastery of scripture, social analysis, and constructive homiletical skill, both areas of research, feminist liberation interpretation, and preaching in the Black church reinforce each other by raising questions, clarifying problems, and amplifying issues that shape our collective consciousness about the survival and wholeness of an entire people. Feminist liberation interpretation. Following Fiorenza's methodology, I would argue that the essential task of a womanist hermeneutic consists in analyzing Black sermonic texts with regard to how they participate in creating or sustaining oppressive or liberating theoretical values and socio-political practices. Womanist analysis provides an interpretive framework that holds together the spiritual matrix of Black religious, cultural, while exposing the complex, baffling contradictions inherent in androcentric language. I am arguing for a critical evaluation of sermonic texts, including an analysis of when and how women are mentioned and whether these sermons adequately reflect African American reality. Fiorenza's methodology can be likened to detective work, which does not rely solely on historical facts nor invent its evidence. Instead, it engages in an imaginative reconstruction that rests upon observations and inference. It employs a critical analysis of whether scriptural texts in sermons mention women only as problems or as exceptions. The task of womanist homiletics is to unearth what Black preachers are saying about women and what we are saying about men. A critical study of Black sermons shows that African American church traditions and redactional processes follow certain androcentric interests and perspectives that do not reflect the historical contributions of African American women's leadership and participation in the life of the church. By showing the detailed and numerous androcentric injunctions about women's nature, place, and behavior in Black preaching, we are able to identify and critique sermonic texts that express and maintain patriarchal historical conditioning. We are also able to highlight those sermons that reproduce and shape the liberative realities for all members of the worshiping community. A womanist adaptation of Fiorenza's integrative heuristic model seeks to provide a means of ethical assessment that can help the Black church community look at the practices and habits, assumptions and problems, values and hopes embedded in its Christian cultural mindset. It does so with the hope of renewing and reforming the faith justice praxis in the black preaching tradition. It is essential that womanist interpretive practices be employed not only in the critique of androcentric preaching, with its references to patriarchal relationships of inequality, we must also use womanist methodology at the constructive stage of sermon preparation and deliverance. Okay, what she's saying here is that there is more of looking at women in a negative light in sermons in the black church that we need to get away from. We need to concentrate more exegesing the text in light of women's positive contributions to the story, and that will speak life to women in church, and not always the condescending women in the Bible reflected upon the women who are listening in church. So we need to reflect more on the positive, and see what contributions you say. You're talking about Mary Magdalene, prostituting Mary Magdalene, and whoring Gomer. How does that speak life? How does that speak? How does that speak? We need to reinterpret or reimagine how we say those things. We don't have to say whoring Gomer. She had there's whoring men, but they never speak about that. They don't speak about the adulterousness of David, but more on the women who fell short. But women have made positive contributions, and that's what we need to focus on as well. There's a lot more to this. That was only a part of that chapter. I encourage you to read more. We're going to stop here because of time. I don't want to hold you too long, but there's more to that chapter that I am actually going to read myself. But she deals with a lot of issues. We did go through the table of contents and see what the entirety of the book is about. I think maybe we might come back and read a little more, because she talks about Zora Neale Hurston, and then she talks about her own viewpoint and racism and economics and so forth. So this is a good book to have in your library, or to at least read through once to see what that womanism and womanist theology is really all about. So anyway, that was thick. So we need to read some more about that. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope that it spoke to you in some way. Preachers, let's have a whole, the gender thing, let's realize the contributions of women. Let's realize that they're worth something, that, they're the main givers in church as well. They're the main listeners in church, because the church is mostly women. Everybody knows that the church is mostly women, and we need to there needs to be more equity in churches, not just in the black church, but in the white church as well. Methodism as well. Even though she was the first ordained clergy in Presbyterianism, black woman, we need to have equity in the church, and that's really what this is all about as well. Having equity in society and equity in church. Racism existed in church. That needs to be abolished. Equity across the board. Okay, I love you much. I hope that you're prospering in the Lord, and that you are reading and growing and loving and having a wonderful, wonderful life. Have a wonderful life. Have a wonderful life that God gave it to us. He wants us to have a wonderful life. So anyway, that's it for today. We're going to read some more I have a couple of women preachers I want to deal with. So we're going to deal with them as well. If you have anything that you want to deal with or you would like me to talk about, please talk to me in the comments. Hit the like, subscribe, and hit the comments and talk. Let's have conversation. We can go this direction and we can go further in some other directions as well. Love you with the love of the Lord. Have a great, fantastic day. Remember the book, Katie's Canon. I also have a couple of books that are on sale on Amazon. God's Method. We might deal with that one time here. So that supports. Feel free to pick that one up. All right. May the Lord watch between me and thee while we're absent one from another. In Jesus' name, amen.